Two young black twins are found living in a park by a disillusioned police officer on a routine patrol. What starts as a standard encounter soon unravels into a deeply emotional journey as the officer discovers the heartbreaking truth about their lives. What will he do when faced with a choice that could change all their futures? Subscribe to the channel and follow along to see how this powerful story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Michael's fingers tightened around the small sketchbook he'd scavenged from a thrift store donation box weeks ago. It was battered, the cover creased, and the edges of the pages frayed, but to him it was a treasure. His twin brother Terrence leaned over his shoulder, watching as he sketched the faint outline of a superhero they'd dreamed up together, a tall, masked figure with a cape that billowed dramatically. They had named him the Protector, a symbol of the security they longed for but couldn't quite grasp. "Make his arms bigger," Terrence suggested, his voice a whisper. Michael raised an eyebrow. "He's already big enough. You want him to look like a bodybuilder or something." Terrence chuckled, his laugh soft but genuine. "I'm just saying, he should look strong enough to take on the world. Unstoppable." Michael smirked but didn't argue. They both knew it wasn't just about the drawing. It was about imagining someone who could keep them safe, someone who would never let them down. Behind them, the park's silence stretched out. It wasn't truly quiet. Of course, there was always the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of cars, and the occasional bark of a dog from the nearby houses. But it was a world away from the chaos they'd fled, the endless noise of shelters, the sharp words of strangers, and the deafening silence of people who refused to meet their eyes. The twins had made this park their home for the past 3 weeks. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was theirs. At least here they could breathe without fear of someone separating them. That fear had been their constant companion since their mother's death 6 months ago, when they were thrust into a system that saw them as numbers instead of people. Michael stuffed the sketchbook into his backpack and leaned back against the wooden bench, his eyes scanning their surroundings. His gaze stopped at the corner of the park where they'd stashed their makeshift shelter, a worn tarp strung between 2 trees. It wasn't much, but it had kept them dry during the occasional rain. "Think they're looking for us?" Terrence asked, breaking the fragile tranquility. Michael knew who they meant: the social workers, the authorities, the adults who claimed to want what was best but always seemed to make things worse. "Maybe," Michael admitted, "but they won't find us. Not if we're careful." Terrence didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he pulled his knees to his chest and rested his chin on them. "You think Mom would be mad at us for running?" Michael's chest tightened. He hated these moments when Terrence's mask of confidence slipped, revealing the scared kid underneath. He wanted to give him a comforting answer, but the truth was, he didn't know. "She'd understand," Michael said finally. "She'd know we're doing the best we can." Terrence nodded slowly, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. Across town, Officer Nathan Collins adjusted the brim of his patrol cap and sighed. It had been another uneventful night so far, the kind that made him question why he'd chosen this job in the first place. He used to believe in the idea of protecting and serving, but years of seeing the worst humanity had to offer had dulled that belief into something brittle and cracked. The buzz of his radio broke his thoughts. "All units, keep an eye out for any suspicious activity near Cedar Grove Park. Residents have reported a few sightings of kids loitering after dark. Could be runaways." Nathan's jaw tightened. He hated calls like this, not because he didn't care about runaway kids, but because they were a stark reminder of how broken the world was. He'd seen too many kids chewed up and spit out by a system that was supposed to protect them. And yet here he was, patrolling a neighborhood that would rather sweep its problems under the rug than confront them. He flicked on his headlights and steered toward the park. Michael was dozing lightly, his head tilted back against the bench, when Terrence nudged him awake. "Someone's coming," Terrence whispered, his voice tense. Michael sat up instantly, his senses on high alert. Sure enough, the unmistakable beam of headlights cut through the darkness, growing brighter as a vehicle approached. "Pack up," Michael hissed. He grabbed their backpack, shoving the tarp and their meager belongings into it as quickly as possible. Terrence fumbled with the zipper of his own bag, his hands trembling. What if it's just someone walking their dog? "It's not." Michael's voice was firm. They didn't wait to find out. The twins slipped into the shadows of the trees, moving silently and swiftly. They'd practiced this many times, always ready to disappear at a moment's notice. But tonight their luck ran out. The headlights came to a stop, and the beam from a flashlight cut through the darkness. "Hey, hold it right there." Michael froze. He could hear the gravel crunch under the officer's boots as he approached. Terrence looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. "Run," Michael whispered. But before they could take another step, the officer's voice rang out again, this time closer. "I said stop." Terrence stumbled and Michael reached out to steady him, but it was too late. The flashlight beam landed on them, illuminating their small, frightened figures. Nathan lowered his flashlight slightly, his sharp tones softening when he saw the boys. "You two, what are you doing out here?" Michael straightened, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "We're not doing anything wrong." Nathan took a step closer, his eyes scanning their ragged clothes and the dirt smudged on their faces. He sighed. "You're not supposed to be out here. Do you have somewhere to go?" Michael didn't answer. Terrence, standing slightly behind him, gripped the strap of his backpack like a lifeline. "Look," Nathan said, crouching slightly to meet their eye level, "I'm not here to get you in trouble, but it's not safe for kids to be out in the park like this. Where are your parents?" The silence that followed was heavy. Nathan sighed again, softer this time. "Okay, let's try this another way. I'm Officer Collins. What are your names?" Michael glanced at Terrence, who gave a barely perceptible nod. "Michael," he said cautiously, "and this is my brother Terrence." "All right, Michael and Terrence," Nathan said, his tone careful and measured. "Why don't you come with me to the station? We'll figure out how to get you home." "We're fine where we are," Michael said, his voice hardening. Nathan frowned. "Sleeping on a park bench isn't fine." Michael squared his shoulders. "It's better than the alternative." Nathan studied the boys for a long moment. He recognized the defiance in Michael's eyes, the same look he'd seen in countless others who had been let down too many times. "Listen," Nathan said, his voice softening even more. "I don't know what you've been through, but running isn't the answer. Let me help you." Michael's jaw tightened, and he said nothing. Terrence, however, whispered, "We don't need help. We just need to stay together." The raw honesty in Terrence's words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. He'd seen enough to know that staying together wasn't always an option for kids in their position. "All right," Nathan said finally. "I won't force you to come with me tonight. But you can't stay here. Let me take you somewhere safe." Michael hesitated. For the first time, the confident facade cracked, and a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Nathan didn't press further. He simply waited, hoping that his patience would be enough to earn their trust. Michael hesitated for what felt like an eternity, his fingers gripping the strap of his backpack so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't trust easily, and especially not someone in a uniform. Cops were the ones who separated families, who asked questions but didn't really listen, who thought they were helping when they were just making things worse. But Terrence's quiet voice broke the stalemate. "Maybe we should go with him, Michael, just for tonight. We don't have to stay." Michael turned to his brother, his resolve wavering. Terrence's wide eyes, filled with exhaustion and fear, were impossible to ignore. They hadn't slept properly in days, always half awake and ready to run at the first sign of trouble. "Fine," Michael muttered, his voice low and begrudging. "But just tonight." Nathan straightened from his crouch, the faintest flicker of relief crossing his face. "All right," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Let's get you out of the cold." The boys followed him to the patrol car, their footsteps hesitant. Nathan opened the back door and gestured for them to get in, but Michael froze. "We're not criminals," he said, his voice sharp. Nathan paused, then nodded. "You're right. You can sit up front if you want." Michael eyed him suspiciously but eventually nodded. He climbed into the passenger seat while Terrence slid into the back, clutching his backpack as though it might vanish if he let it go. The ride was silent at first, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of Nathan's radio. Michael stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, while Terrence leaned his head against the window, his eyelids drooping. Nathan glanced at the boys through the rearview mirror, his thoughts racing. They couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13 at most. The older one, Michael, carried himself like a protector too mature for his age, with a guarded demeanor that hinted at how much he'd already endured. The younger one, Terrence, seemed quieter, more vulnerable. Nathan broke the silence cautiously. "So where have you been staying?" Michael didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Terrence, however, murmured, "The park." Nathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed stirred something in him, a mixture of anger at the system that had failed them and a deep sadness for what they must have gone through. "You've got no one else?" he asked gently. "Our mom died," Michael said abruptly, his tone clipped. "That's all you need to know." Nathan nodded, choosing his words carefully. "I'm sorry to hear that. Really, but you don't have to go through this alone." Michael let out a humorless laugh. "We've been alone since the day she died. No one cares about kids like us." The bitterness in his voice struck a chord with Nathan. He wanted to argue, to tell Michael that someone did care, but he knew words wouldn't be enough. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Nathan parked the car but didn't get out right away. He turned to Michael, his expression serious but kind. "Look, I know you've got no reason to trust me, but I'm not just going to hand you over to people who don't care. Let me figure something out, okay?" Michael didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. Nathan led the boys into the station, keeping a hand lightly on Terrence's shoulder to guide him. The station was quiet at this hour, the fluorescent lights casting a cold, sterile glow. A few officers glanced at the trio as they entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to mild indifference. Nathan guided them to an empty office and set a box of granola bars and bottled water on the desk. "Here," he said, "you must be hungry." Terrence grabbed a granola bar immediately, tearing into it with the hunger of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. Michael hesitated but eventually took one too, watching Nathan warily the entire time. As the boys ate, Nathan sat across from them, his hands clasped in front of him. "I need to ask you some questions," he said carefully. "Not to get you in trouble, but to understand how I can help." Michael narrowed his eyes. "We don't need help. We just need to stay together." Nathan nodded. "I get that. And I'll do everything I can to make sure that happens. But I need to know, how long have you been on your own?" Terrence spoke up this time, his voice quiet. "Since the foster people came, they wanted to split us up. We ran away before they could." Nathan's stomach churned. He'd heard stories like this before, but seeing it firsthand was different. These weren't just statistics or case files, they were two scared, determined kids fighting to survive in a world that had abandoned them. "I won't let that happen," Nathan said, his voice steady. "You have my word." For the first time, Michael's expression softened slightly. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. Nathan leaned back in his chair, the dim glow of the computer screen illuminating his face as he typed in the boys' names, Michael and Terrence Shaw. He'd promised them he'd help, and now he needed to figure out exactly how. The station was eerily quiet, the distant hum of a vending machine the only sound. The boys were in the next room, likely curled up on the old couch in the station break room. He'd told them they could stay there for the night, but even as he'd said it, he'd known it was a stopgap solution at best. They needed stability, not another temporary shelter. The search results blinked onto the screen. Case file: Shaw, Michael and Terrence, ward of the state. Pending placement: failed attempt at fostering separated. Current status: missing. Nathan scrolled through the file, his heart sinking with every word. The boy's mother, Denise Shaw, had passed away from complications related to untreated diabetes, a grim reminder of how poverty often went hand in hand with preventable tragedies. No father was listed on their birth certificates, and no relatives had stepped forward to claim them. The file detailed their brief time in the foster system, a series of failed placements and attempts to separate them, each more disastrous than the last. In one entry, a foster parent had noted that Michael was difficult and uncooperative. While Terrence was withdrawn and overly dependent on his brother, Nathan clenched his jaw. These weren't behavioral problems, these were survival mechanisms. A knock on the doorframe pulled him from the screen. He looked up to see Officer Ramirez, a colleague and one of the few people on the force he trusted. "Burning the midnight oil?" Ramirez asked, stepping into the office. He nodded toward the computer. "What's the case?" Nathan hesitated. 2 kids. Runaways. Ramirez's brow furrowed. "The ones in the break room." "Yeah, they've been living in the park. Lost their mom, and the system's trying to split them up." Ramirez let out a low whistle. "That's rough. What are you going to do?" Nathan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know yet. They don't trust the system, can't blame them, and I can't send them back into the same mess that failed them." "You thinking of going around the system?" Ramirez's tone was cautious, but there was no judgment. Nathan shrugged. "I'm thinking about what's best for them. The rules don't seem to have done much for them so far." Ramirez nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You've always had a soft spot for the underdog. Just be careful. You bend the rules too much, and it'll bend you right out of this job." Nathan didn't respond, but Ramirez's words stayed with him as the officer left. Back in the break room, Terrence was already asleep, his small frame curled up under a police-issued blanket. Michael, however, was wide awake, sitting on the couch with his knees pulled to his chest. Nathan walked in, his footsteps deliberately soft. "Couldn't sleep." Michael shook his head. "I don't like being in places like this." Nathan sat down in the chair across from him, resting his elbows on his knees. "Why's that?" Michael shrugged but didn't look away. "Because people always tell you they're going to help, and then they don't." The words hit Nathan harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, studying the boy. "I can't speak for what's happened before, but I'm not going to disappear on you. You have my word." Michael didn't respond, but the defiance in his posture softened just a fraction. The next morning, Nathan decided to follow a lead. He had noticed a note in the boys' file about a social worker who had been particularly insistent on keeping them together, Lisa Carter. Her office was in a modest building on the other side of town, sandwiched between a nail salon and a payday loan shop. Nathan stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of burnt coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights. Lisa looked up from her desk as he approached. She was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of determination that suggested she didn't back down easily. "Officer Collins," she said, standing to shake his hand. "How can I help you?" Nathan explained the situation, and as he spoke, Lisa's expression shifted from polite interest to deep concern. "They're alive?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Nathan nodded. "Alive and together. But they're scared. They don't want to go back into the system." Lisa sighed, sinking back into her chair. "I don't blame them. I fought tooth and nail to keep those boys together, but the foster system is overloaded. They see siblings as numbers, not people." "Is there any way to change that?" Nathan asked. Lisa gave him a weary smile. "I wish. I've been in this job long enough to know that the system moves slower than molasses. But there are ways to work around it. If we can find a foster family willing to take them both, and I mean a really solid family, we might have a shot." Nathan leaned forward. "Do you know anyone like that?" Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "There's a couple, Mark and Evelyn Turner. They've fostered before, and they've been very vocal about wanting to keep siblings together. I can reach out to them." "Do it," Nathan said without hesitation. Back at the station, Nathan shared the news with Michael and Terrence. He knelt in front of the couch so he could meet their eyes. "I found someone who might take you both," he said. "A family. Together." Michael's eyes narrowed. "What's the catch?" "There's no catch," Nathan said firmly. "But you'd have to meet them first. See if you think it could work." Terrence glanced at Michael, his expression hopeful. "Can we try, Michael? Just try." Michael hesitated, but finally nodded. "All right, but if they're like the others, we're leaving." Nathan smiled. "Fair enough." The meeting with the Turners was arranged quickly. Nathan drove the boys to a small, cozy house on the outskirts of town. The front yard was dotted with colorful flowers, and a basketball hoop stood at the end of the driveway. Mark and Evelyn greeted them warmly. their smiles genuine and inviting. Evelyn, a kind-faced woman with curly hair, knelt to Michael and Terrence's level. "We're so happy to meet you," she said gently. "We know this is a big step, but we're here to help however we can." Mark, a tall man with a calm demeanor, chimed in. "We've heard a lot about how close you two are. That's something we really respect." Michael was silent, his guard still firmly in place, but Terrence offered a shy smile. As the afternoon wore on, the Turners gave the boys a tour of the house, showing them the shared bedroom they could decorate however they wanted, a backyard with a treehouse, and a cozy living room filled with books and games. Michael remained cautious, but even he couldn't suppress a flicker of interest when Mark mentioned his love of drawing. By the time they left, Terrence was beaming, and even Michael's posture had relaxed. Back in the car, Terrence turned to Nathan. "Do you think they'll let us stay?" Nathan glanced at Michael, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. "We'll see," Nathan said. "But I think it's a good start." Michael stared out of the car window as the station drew closer, his thoughts swirling. Terrence was unusually quiet in the back seat, clutching his backpack tightly. The meeting with the Turners had gone better than he'd expected, but Michael couldn't let himself believe it could actually work. They'd been let down too many times before. Nathan noticed the silence and cleared his throat. "You okay back there, Terrence?" Terrence nodded but didn't look up. Nathan pulled into the station's parking lot and turned off the engine. "I know today was a lot," he said, turning to face Michael, "but it seemed like you two got along pretty well with the Turners." Michael shrugged, his voice guarded. "They seemed nice." Nathan waited, sensing there was more. When Michael didn't continue, he asked, "What's on your mind?" Michael hesitated, then finally blurted out, "What happens if they don't want us? What if they're just pretending to like us, and then they change their minds like everyone else?" Terrence looked up, his expression mirroring the fear in Michael's voice. Nathan leaned forward, resting his arms on the steering wheel. "Look, I can't promise everything will go perfectly, but from what I saw, the Turners are good people. They're not like the others." Michael frowned. "That's what everyone says." "I get it," Nathan said. "You've been let down before, but I wouldn't have introduced you to them if I didn't think they were serious. And I'll be here to make sure they follow through okay." Michael didn't answer, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. That evening, back in the station's break room, Nathan brought the boys some sandwiches and sat with them at the small, round table. Terrence ate quickly, but Michael picked at his food, deep in thought. "What's going to happen to us?" Terrence asked suddenly, his voice small. Nathan set his sandwich down and looked at the younger boy. "The Turners want to foster you both, and I'll do everything I can to make that happen. It might take a few days to finalize things, but for now, you're safe here." "Why are you helping us?" Michael asked abruptly, his tone edged with suspicion. The question caught Nathan off guard. He leaned back in his chair, considering his answer. "Because you deserve better than what you've been through. And because I've seen too many kids like you fall through the cracks. I don't want that to happen again." Michael studied him, his expression unreadable. "What if it does?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Nathan said firmly. Over the next few days, Nathan spent more time with the boys, building a fragile but growing trust. He brought Terrence books to read and encouraged Michael to sketch in his notebook. One afternoon, Michael even showed Nathan a drawing of the Protector. "This is really good," Nathan said, genuinely impressed. Michael shrugged, but there was a hint of pride in his eyes. He's supposed to protect people, no matter what. He doesn't let anyone down. Nathan smiled. "Sounds like someone we could all use." Michael's guard lowered just a little more. By the time the Turners returned to the station to finalize the paperwork, Terrence was visibly excited, though Michael still held onto a sliver of skepticism. As the Turners sat with Nathan and the boys in the station's meeting room, Evelyn addressed them directly. "We know this is a big step, and we want you to know that we're committed to making this work. You're part of our family now, if you're ready to let us be part of yours." Terrence beamed, his enthusiasm contagious. Michael glanced at him, then at Nathan, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Okay," Michael said quietly, but there was a flicker of hope in his voice. For the first time in months, it felt like things might actually be looking up. Nathan stood outside the Turners' house a few days later, watching as Terrence and Michael explored their new home. The boys were sticking close to each other, moving cautiously, as though unsure if this place was truly theirs. Evelyn stood on the porch, her smile warm but patient, giving the boys space to settle in at their own pace. Nathan felt a rare sense of relief. For once, things seemed to be going right. But as he watched Michael's careful movements, he knew the boys' doubts hadn't fully disappeared. "Thank you for helping us," Evelyn said, stepping closer. "I know this wasn't part of your job description." Nathan chuckled softly. "I think this was the most important part of my job. They're good kids. They just needed someone to give them a chance." Evelyn nodded. "We'll do our best to be that chance." Just as she spoke, Michael's voice drifted over from the yard. "What's this?" Nathan turned to see Michael holding up a basketball, his brows furrowed in suspicion. Mark joined him, a grin spreading across his face. "That's for you two," Mark said, taking the ball from Michael's hands and bouncing it once. "The hoop's out front. Let's see what you've got." Terrence's face lit up, and he immediately ran to join Mark at the hoop. Michael hesitated, then followed, though his movements were slower, more deliberate. Nathan stayed back, observing the scene as Mark showed the boys how to shoot. It wasn't long before Terrence was laughing, his initial shyness melting away. Michael, though quieter, began to relax, a small smile tugging at his lips as he sank a shot. Nathan felt a pang of bittersweet satisfaction. This was what they needed: a home, a family, a chance to be kids again. Later that evening, Nathan returned to the station. The silence of his patrol car felt heavier than usual as he replayed the day's events in his mind. The boys had a real shot now, but he couldn't shake the nagging thought that it might not last. He parked in his usual spot, shutting off the engine and sitting in the dim glow of the streetlights. His gaze fell on the photo tucked into the corner of his dashboard, a picture of his daughter, Emily, from years ago. Emily. He hadn't spoken to her in months. After the divorce, they drifted further apart, and his work had become an excuse to avoid confronting the growing distance. But now, seeing Michael and Terrence's bond, their fierce determination to stay together, he couldn't ignore the ache in his chest. Nathan pulled out his phone, staring at Emily's contact information. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the call button. Meanwhile, at the Turners' house, Michael lay awake in the bedroom he now shared with Terrence. The room was cozy, with soft bedding and posters on the walls, but Michael couldn't shake the fear that it was all temporary. "You think this will last?" Terrence asked from his bed, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. Michael turned to face him. "I don't know, but it's better than the park." Terrence nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I think they like us, the Turners. They seem nice." Michael wanted to believe that, but he couldn't let himself get too comfortable. He'd learned the hard way that trust could be a dangerous thing. As Terrence drifted off to sleep, Michael stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a mix of hope and doubt. Back in his car, Nathan finally pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked as Emily's voice answered on the other end. "Dad." "Hey, Emily," Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been a while." "Yeah, it has," she replied, her tone cautious but not unkind. "What's up?" Nathan took a deep breath. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing, and maybe see if we could grab lunch sometime. I miss you." There was a long pause, during which Nathan's heart raced. "Yeah," Emily said finally. "I think I'd like that." Nathan smiled, a weight lifting from his chest. "Great. Let me know when you're free." As the call ended, Nathan leaned back in his seat, feeling a small but powerful sense of redemption. The days turned into weeks, and Michael and Terrence gradually settled into life with the Turners. For Terrence, it was easier. He quickly bonded with Evelyn, who made a point to sit with him every night, reading stories or helping him with his schoolwork. His laughter came more freely now, echoing through the house and lightening the air. For Michael, the transition was slower. He spent most of his time sketching in his notebook, retreating to the backyard treehouse when things felt overwhelming. Mark tried to connect with him, offering to play basketball or work on small projects around the house, but Michael kept his guard up. Nathan visited often, checking in on the boys and sitting with them during their family dinners. He noticed how Terrence flourished and how Michael remained reserved. He knew it would take time, but he also knew the Turners were in it for the long haul. One crisp autumn afternoon, Nathan arrived unannounced, carrying 2 boxes. The boys were outside, Michael sitting on the porch steps while Terrence played with a stray cat that had wandered into the yard. "Hey boys," Nathan called out as he walked up the driveway. Terrence waved excitedly. "Hi, Officer Nathan." Michael looked up but said nothing, his expression cautious as always. Nathan set the boxes down on the porch. "Thought you might like this," he said, lifting the lid off the larger box. Inside was an art kit, colored pencils, markers, paints, and sketch pads, all neatly arranged. Michael's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like the 12-year-old he was, rather than the wary, guarded boy life had forced him to become. "Is this for me?" Nathan nodded. "Figured you could use some new supplies. Thought it might help with your superhero." Michael's fingers brushed over the supplies, but he didn't say anything. Terrence broke the silence. "What's in the other box?" he asked. Nathan grinned and opened the second box, revealing a basketball signed by several local college players. "For you, champ. I heard you've been practicing." Terrence beamed. "This is awesome, thank you." Nathan looked at Michael, who was still staring at the art supplies. "What do you think, Michael?" After a long pause, Michael finally muttered, "Thanks." It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, Michael sat in the treehouse with his new sketch pad, his pencils arranged in a neat row beside him. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting golden shadows on the page. He sketched slowly, carefully, the image of the protector taking shape once again. But this time something was different. He drew 2 smaller figures standing beside the hero, a boy with glasses and a boy with messy hair. The hero's cape billowed out, shielding them both. For the first time, Michael felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months' hope. Nathan, meanwhile, was driving back to the station. His thoughts drifted to Emily, who had agreed to meet him for lunch the following week. It wasn't much, but it was a step toward rebuilding their relationship. The boys had changed something in him, reminded him of what really mattered. He'd spent years hiding behind his badge, letting his work define him, but now he saw things differently. Helping Michael and Terrence had shown him that it wasn't enough to enforce the law, he needed to be part of the solution. A few weeks later, the boys attended their first parent-teacher conference at their new school. Evelyn and Mark sat with their teachers, listening to glowing reviews of Terrence's progress and cautious optimism about Michael's adjustment. "He's a bright kid," one teacher said, holding up a folder of Michael's drawings. "He's incredibly talented. He just needs time to feel comfortable." After the meeting, Evelyn handed Michael the folder. "Your teachers are really proud of you," she said gently. Michael shrugged but didn't push it away. That weekend, the Turners invited Nathan over for dinner. The boys were in high spirits, showing Nathan their latest projects, Terrence's basketball drills and Michael's updated sketches of the protector. "You've got quite the talent," Nathan said, flipping through the pages of Michael's sketchpad. Michael didn't reply, but he didn't pull the sketchpad away either. After dinner, the boys disappeared into the backyard, leaving Nathan and the Turners alone in the kitchen. "How are they really doing?" Nathan asked. Evelyn smiled. "Terrence is thriving. He's made friends at school and he's so eager to learn. Michael, he's still guarded, but I think he's starting to trust us. It's slow, but we'll get there." Nathan nodded. "They're lucky to have you." "We're lucky to have them," Evelyn replied. Months passed, and the boys settled further into their new lives. Terrence joined the school basketball team, and Michael's artwork began to gain attention in his classes. One day, Michael approached Nathan during one of his visits. "I've been working on something," he said, holding out a carefully folded piece of paper. Nathan unfolded it to reveal a new sketch of the protector, but this time, the hero wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a smaller figure wearing a badge. Nathan's throat tightened. Is this me? Michael nodded, his expression serious. You helped us. I wanted you to know. Nathan smiled, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Michael. This means a lot. The story ended not with a dramatic conclusion, but with quiet moments of growth and healing. Michael and Terrence had found a home, and Nathan had found a new sense of purpose. In the end, it wasn't just the boys who had been saved. Nathan, too, had found a way back to the things that mattered most.